Now we've come to the third component of meaning, the word. Using Greek in Bible study is more than just doing a series of word studies. It's about looking at the surrounding context and grammar. So here are 3 basic steps to do a word study. First, identify a key word for study. 2, gather information on that word. And 3, apply the information back to that word. Now those 3 steps form the outline for this episode. So first, we need to identify a key word. Here are some ideas for doing that. First, you can study a word that's unclear in English, either for you or your audience. Even with a casual reading of the Gospel of John, you can see that the word sign is important to John's overall structure, purpose, and theme for the book. But that observation doesn't necessarily translate into understanding what this word means. Now, if you're only working with English, you can of course look up this word in an English dictionary. For example, Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. And here we can see that there are several definitions given for the word. One is a motion or gesture. Another is a signal, maybe a fundamental linguistic unit, a set of gestures used to represent language. None of these really seem to fit. The others talking about a musical character, mathematical character. Maybe the only one that seems to be the closest to working is here, something material or external that stands for or signifies something spiritual. But even at that, the problem is we're looking at English first and how the word sign is used in contemporary English versus looking at the word underlying the English word sign, which is in Greek, semeion, looking at how that word is used in John's Gospel and in the New Testament. Now, because we've applied some of the definitions here to the usage in John, we've seen that there is a bit of a mismatch. And most likely, because there's lack of clarity here, there's probably going to be lack of clarity for yourself and for your audience as to what the word sign means. And because of that, this word is a good candidate for a word study. You can also look for words that appear repeatedly in a book or a passage. Now, we want to find the repeated words in the book of Galatians. Now, ideally, you will have read through the book for yourself and kept track of the repeated words. But in case you want maybe statistics or something like that, you can use a morphology search to find the repeated words. Go up to Search, and I've already constructed this search for us, but you want to make sure that you have Morph selected here. I've defined the range to Galatians. If you don't have that, you can go right down here to New Reference Range, type in Galatians, and title that range as well, Galatians. And I've limited this to one resource, the ESV, and with Logos Greek Morphology. Now in the Find box, we want to type an @ symbol and select from the part of speech menu, drop down, noun. And you'll see the rest of these categories open up. Leave those unselected. You can go ahead and click Search. And if you don't already have the analysis view selected, you want to make sure you select that. And here you'll see this, what looks like a spreadsheet, open up for you here. You may have more columns shown here than what I have. The way you can select or make those appear or disappear is by right-clicking any one of these column headers, and you can select and deselect these. The ones that you need to keep an eye out for is, for right now, is lemma. Grab this column here and drag it up to this spot. And now what this does is that it sorts all of the occurrences, or all the results, by lemma, or the dictionary form. And the way that benefits us is this. We can collapse with these disclosure triangle, and we can start to see which nouns appear most frequently. We see these results here, so Christos appears 38 times. Nomos, which is translated as this gloss definition of law, 32 times, theos, 30 times, pistis, pneuma, sarx. And almost right here, just by looking at the nouns, you can get an idea of the themes of the book. And you can start to see the sort of contrast that Paul was laying out here. Law versus faith, and spirit versus flesh. A key word may also be an abstract noun or theological term. Be sure not to overlook common terms either. In Romans 5:1, we have a word here that could be considered a theological term. The word is justified. It comes from the Greek dikaiao, or the noun form, justification, which comes from dikaiasune. Now, determining whether or not something is a theological term is a bit subjective, but the key question that you want to maybe ask is there a doctrine about this word? You can go to a few resources to help you answer that question. Kind of resource that you can look at is a systematic theology. Here I have J.I. Packer's Concise Theology open, and in the table of contents you can see there's a section here on justification, and the beginning of this article starts out with the doctrine of justification. So you can see that this word, there is a doctrine about it. Now when you go to use a systematic theology and you look at the table of contents, not everything in this list here is going to be found in the Bible. For example, effectual calling won't be found in the Bible. But you can see how you can use this resource to answer that question, is there a doctrine about it? Going back to the ESV, we have a couple of abstract nouns here, both faith and peace. So I mentioned earlier that you may want to do a word study on words that are unfamiliar, but at the same time, you may want to consider doing word studies on words that are perhaps too familiar. For example, sometimes we can look at these words in English and think that we already know what they mean, when there's definitely a unique sense to them, when the Bible has a different perspective on that term than we would think about in our culture. Words that have one meaning in the Bible, but another meaning in popular culture, are good candidates for word study. Now that could be said of almost any word in the New Testament, but it's especially true of this word here in 2 Corinthians 1:1, the word church, which in Greek is ekklesia. Now, in the New Testament, this word refers to the people of God. But in contemporary English, the word has a different meaning, and we can see that when we look at Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. And in the century, we can see several senses to the word, and these senses are ordered historically. That is, the sense to have been used first in English is entered first. Now from that, you might be able to draw the conclusion that this is the most commonly used sense, that church refers to or means a building for public and especially Christian worship. And it's not until sense 3 that you get down here to the more biblical sense, a body or organization of religious believers, a whole body of Christians. So if you were to use the word church in this first sense, would it be wrong? Well, not in contemporary English usage. The dictionary here is merely describing how the word is used. It's not prescribing necessarily how it should be used. That is to say, we wouldn't want to take this definition and put it back onto the Bible, because for starters, we'd want to use Greek and not English to determine that meaning. The next step in doing a word study is to gather information on that word. Now I've chosen the English word sign, which is a translation of the Greek word semeion, for our word study. I've done this for two reasons. The first reason is that this word is central to John's purpose for writing this gospel. You can see that these signs are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. The second reason why I've picked this word is because of its ambiguity in English. I showed you earlier in an example that even in our Webster's dictionary, we don't have a sense of sign in English that matches the same sense that is used in the Bible. And so that makes it a good candidate for word study. So we've completed the first step, which is to identify a key word. Now we're on to the second step, gathering information on that word. Now, we could go straight to a lexicon here by right-clicking or even through the reverse interlinear pane below, but I want to show you how you can do the work of a lexicon for yourself. And once you understand the process, you're going to be able to better evaluate lexicons and actually do a little bit more detailed work than even they have. So first, we need to make the transition from English into Greek. And we can do this by the right-clicking on the word signs and make sure that we have lemma selected here, semeion. And now you can see that we have a menu over here. And you might think that we would start with Bible word study, perhaps. We're not going to do that. We're going to instead search this resource. And the reason why we want to do that is because we want to take notes, create a note file, take notes on each occurrence of the word semeion in the Gospel of John, and limiting our search just to that one book. So let's click Search this resource, and you'll notice that here we have our search range is all passages. We want to change that to John. If you don't have this category, you can type in that reference range of John and give it the title here and save it. I'm going to go ahead and select John. And you can see that for the search results view, I have selected analysis. I have analysis selected because of one very important step in the Bible word study process is that you want to look at the semantic range, or just another way of saying the range of meaning of a word. And we have the words in the New Testament annotated or tagged with this Louw-Nida semantic domain number. In the analysis view, your categories here may look different than mine. I've narrowed them down a bit. You can do that by simply right-clicking on one of these columns and deselecting or selecting the different categories of information here. So I've modified mine. The reason why I have analysis view selected is because I want to sort the information on the word semeion by Louw-Nida number. And what this will do is this will give me the range of meaning of this word. Remember, keep in mind that translation of a word is not the same thing as the range of meaning. In an earlier example, we looked at the word run in English, and even though it's the same form, even the same inflection in a different context, it has a different meaning. And it's the same here with the word sign, or in Greek, semeion. And in the Gospel of John, you can see that we have these 17 results, and they all have the same Louw-Nida semantic domain number, 33.477. So in this instance, with this word, we're looking at the same meaning within one book. And it's pretty straightforward with this example, but say we were to do another word study on another important word in the Gospel of John, which is cosmos. And I've already performed that search before, so I'm going to scroll down my list here of my searches, and here we go. And I want to limit this to the Gospel of John. And now this is already sorted for me by Louw-Nida semantic domain. And if I collapse this disclosure triangle here, you're going to see the different ranges of meaning of this word cosmos in the Gospel of John, referring to human beings, geographical objects, behavior, related states. So you can see at a glance, by sorting by Louw-Nida semantic domain number, the range of meaning of the word cosmos within the Gospel of John. So sorting by domain number can help you narrow down your search focus. So sorting by semantic domain number can help you refine your search and help you focus on which occurrences of the word to study. Let's go ahead and close this search results and go back to our earlier example, semeion. So now we want to make a note file and take notes on the different occurrences of this word within the Gospel of John. Let's go up to File, and let's select Notes. And let's drag this right into the middle and name this Bible Word Study on Sign in John. And now in our search results, we want to go over here and click on this first occurrence of the word. And we want to keep in mind the larger context. So we might want to scroll up a bit, and we can go ahead and close the interlinear pane down at the bottom. And now we want to add a note to this verse here in John 2:11. And make sure that we have reference selected here. Let's click Add Note to our note file. So what I want to do when I gather information in this way is to take note of how the word is used in its different contexts. And there are a couple different categories of information that I want to gather here. The first one I would call occasion. Let's make a bullet point here. And occasion has to do with the time and place of the use of the word. So here in John 2, we're looking at a wedding in Cana of Galilee. And that happens at verse 1. The next thing we want to take note of is the characters involved. We have the guests, which include Jesus and his disciples and his mother, as well as servants. And the next category of information is event. And this includes actually the verbal action, what happens. Jesus turns water into wine. And the last thing we want to take note of is the result of that event or action. We see that the result is the disciples believe. And there's also a second result from this action. His glory is manifested. And this is also called his first sign. So just to review, we're gathering information as to how this word is used in terms of the time and place, who's involved, what action happens, and the result of that action. And as we do this, we'll start to notice a pattern of what other words are used or associated with the word semeion. From this first occurrence, we learned that semeion involves something miraculous. Water being turned into wine is something that doesn't happen by age or anything else. No matter how long water is kept, it will never change into a state of wine. But here, Jesus alters the state of it. And the result is that the disciples believe and that the glory of God, the glory of Jesus, is manifested. Now for the next number of occurrences, I'll have already made the notes for these, and I'll just walk you through them. So let's look at the next occurrence in John 2:18. So here's the next occurrence of semeion in John's Gospel, in John chapter 2, verse 18. And as before, we want to take note of several different kinds of information here. The first being occasion, the when and the where of this context. We can see that the Passover is at hand, and that this action occurs at the temple in Jerusalem. Now, you want to keep in mind that the Passover feast is associated or tied to the Exodus event from the book of Exodus. Just keep that in the back of your mind as we work our way through these occurrences of the word semeion in John's Gospel. Now next, we need to look at the characters involved. That involves Jesus, as well as there are some money changers or merchants, as well as in verse 18, we see that the Jews are involved as well. And now we need to look at the event that surrounds this use of the word semeion. Jesus, going into the temple, drives out the merchants and money changers along with the animals. And this is because they've turned his father's house into a house of trade. Now, in response to this action or event, the Jews ask him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Or in other words, what sign can you show us that will demonstrate that you have the right or the authority for doing these things? And Jesus, in response to them, talks about the resurrection of his body temple. And at the moment, they don't understand that he's talking about his physical body. They think that he's talking about the temple there in Jerusalem. And even his disciples didn't really understand it either. Only until after he was raised from the dead did they remember and then believe the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. So in this passage, in response to the event of driving out the money changers, the key issue here is one of authority, which even though that word doesn't occur in this verse or passage, it's clearly behind their question. And note that Jesus also bases his authority off of his ability to give life in terms of his resurrection, but also because he refers to God as his Father. And also note, finally, that this resurrection is also a sign which spurs his disciples to belief. And the next occurrence of the word Semeion, which is translated signs, occurs in John 2:23. And again, the occasion, as before, is the Passover feast. And note that many people witnessed the signs, and that the result of this event is that they believed in his name. So we can see again that as before, belief or faith is associated with signs. The next occurrence of Semeion happens in John chapter 3, verse 2. And here, the occasion, if taken in chronological order with what preceded, we'd have to assume that the location is Jerusalem still, and the time is at night. The characters involved are Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews, and Jesus. Now, the main action here in this passage is a conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus. But this conversation was actually initiated in the heart of Nicodemus when he observed the signs that Jesus had been performing. And notice what he says here, "Rabbi, we know you're a teacher, come from God, for no one can do these things that you do unless God is with him." So here, this occurrence of Semeion, according to Nicodemus's understanding, Semeion supplied some sort of approval by God. It showed that somebody was legitimate or validated by God. This observation will become more and more frequent as we look at the rest of the occurrences. Now, in the rest of the passage, Nicodemus actually comes away confused by Jesus' teaching. In verse 4, he asks, "How can a man be born when he is old?" In verse 9, he says, "How can these things be?" So it's important to take note here that even though Nicodemus saw the signs and was interested in what Jesus had to say or teach about them, or about the kingdom of God, that Nicodemus didn't get it, he didn't understand, and that at this point, he did not believe. All of these observations are important considering the broader context, because Nicodemus may have been one of those who was at the temple when Jesus drove out the money changers and merchants, but also we'll see that Nicodemus, being a ruler of the Jews, is important for the next occurrence of the word Semeion. Here in the context of this occurrence of Semeion, in John 4:48, Jesus is back in Cana, where the first miracle or sign was mentioned, turning water into wine. And here the characters involved are an official and his son who is ill, as well as Jesus. And part one of the event described here is that this official, like Nicodemus, had heard or seen that Jesus had this unique or extraordinary ability to heal or perform miraculous signs. And here in verse 48, Jesus pairs together two words, signs along with wonders. And he again, as with the other occurrences, links belief to signs. The official asks Jesus to visit his son, and Jesus, in response, says, "Go, your son will live." And so the official believed Jesus and went on his way. The result of Jesus' healing of the official's son brings the official himself to believe, as well as his whole household. Now, I've walked you through this passage in sort of a play-by-play fashion because I hope you saw the contrast between this passage and the preceding ones. Jesus being here in Cana, in Galilee. Sometimes this is referred to as Galilee of the Gentiles. And we have an official here. Some commentators believe that the official was a Gentile. So you can start to see the contrast here between Jesus and his interactions in Jerusalem, which actually led to conflict, that with his own people, the Jewish religious leaders, who didn't understand what he was saying. Jesus would talk about his resurrection or talk about being born of the Spirit, and religious leaders not quite understanding what he was talking about. But here, an official in Galilee takes Jesus at his word and goes and returns to his son who has been healed. And as a result, he believes and his whole household believes. So once again, there's the association of authority. This official recognizes that Jesus has authority over these things. And again, believing is something else that's associated with signs. And that brings us to verse 54, which is our next occurrence of the word Semeion. Now this is the second sign that Jesus did when he had come from Judea to Galilee. In John chapter 5, there was no mention of Simeon, but here in chapter 6, we have several occurrences of the word here. And we want to start first by looking at the occasion. And here we have the place, which is on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is also called Sea of Tiberias. We find that the time frame is the Passover is at hand. And we see that the more specific location of this event is Jesus when he goes up on the mountain. And the characters involved are Jesus and his disciples, as well as a large crowd. Now, all of these observations are important, not just fun facts. Think about where else you've seen a sea and a large crowd and a mountain, as well as the Passover. The book of Exodus. You can start to see these connections once you make these observations as to the location. The gospel writers chose these particular events very carefully, and they wanted to make sure that their readers got the parallels between the events of Jesus' life on earth and the events of Israel in the Old Testament. Now, the event that sets this story into motion is in verse 2, where the large crowds were following him because they saw the signs he was doing on the sick, maybe the same sorts of signs that were mentioned for the official son in chapter 4. And so the result of this event is that the crowds are interested in Jesus and they follow him. But notice that there's no mention of belief or believing. Now Jesus, when he sees the large crowds, he decides to feed them, and he involves his disciples in this ministry. And then in verse 14 of chapter 6, we have our next occurrence of the word sign. So scrolling down, we see that Jesus has performed another sign by multiplying the food to feed all of the people. And the result of Jesus' action or sign is that the people see the sign and they make a comment as to Jesus' identity. They identify him as the prophet who was to come into the world. Now, considering the larger context here involving the crowd and the sea, the mountain, and the bread, the reference here to the prophet may intersect with Deuteronomy 18:15 and 18, where Moses talks about the Lord raising up another prophet like himself for Israel. And this is the first occurrence where we see that a sign can identify someone for a specific office, like prophet, for example. But notice that even though they've identified Jesus as the prophet, there is still no mention of belief or believing. In fact, we can see from verse 15 that Jesus isn't impressed with their observation and withdraws from them. The occasion for the next two occurrences of Simeon in John chapter 6, verses 26 and 30, is that it's the next day, and the crowd has traveled to Capernaum by boat. And the event here is described by Jesus in verse 26, where he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves," referencing his miracle of multiplication of the bread. Now, in verse 27, Jesus uses the food, or the bread, as a point of connection to point people to the true purpose to give eternal life. And notice how Jesus tries to bring correction here, that people shouldn't focus on the food, but on the person. Jesus points to himself. And Jesus goes on to instruct the crowd that they're not to labor for food, but instead the work of God is that they believe in the one whom he has sent. And then it gets very strange at verse 30. Even though the crowd has seen Jesus perform a sign already, they ask him, "Then what sign do you do, that we may see and believe you? What work would you perform?" And then in verse 31, they go on to talk about how their fathers ate manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Now notice how they associate sign with the exodus from Egypt and with Moses. Remember the earlier context looking at the mountain and the bread and the sea, as well as the Passover, all of those things being associated with the Exodus event? Well, here there's an explicit connection made by the crowd. Now, then scrolling down in verse 35, we can see that Jesus takes what they've said and turns it around, refers to himself as the bread of life. And here he talks about his relation to the Father. But in verse 41, the Jews grumbled about him because he said, "I'm the bread that came down from heaven." Here the issue of grumbling focuses or centers around Jesus' identity. And notice that unlike the disciples, the crowd does not believe. Instead, they grumble among themselves, just as the Israelites did in the wilderness. So we can see from this passage that even though signs are designed to call people to believe, that doesn't always happen. And we can also learn that identifying Jesus by a certain title like prophet doesn't mean that people are disciples or have faith either. Now, let's move on to the next example in John 7:31. The occasion for this occurrence of Simeon in verse 31 is the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem, mentioned up at verse 2 of chapter 7. The characters involved are the people of Jerusalem, here in verse 25, and the event is a debate about Jesus' identity as the Christ in verses 26 and 27. The result of this debate is that many do believe, as it says that in verse 31, with the people saying, "When the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done?" And from this question, we can gather that signs, Simeon, can make a person a candidate to be the Christ. Again, this is another office that is associated with signs. And in response to this discussion among the people, the Pharisees hear this, and the chief priests get together with them and try to arrest Jesus to put an end to this sort of talk. But more conflict occurs in John chapter 9. The background for this occurrence of Simeon in John chapter 9 is that Jesus has healed a blind man on the Sabbath, and the characters involved are the Pharisees, as well as Jesus and the blind man. And the event is a debate about Jesus' identity here in verse 16. Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And so you can gather from this discussion or debate that doing signs shows that one is from God, shows that, in a sense, one is legitimate or approved by God. And tied together with the previous occurrences, we can see that one is approved to a specific office, like that of a prophet or Christ. Now here in John chapter 9, we'll see a contrast between two types of people. As we saw earlier in John, for example, in chapter 2, where the religious leaders didn't understand what Jesus meant by raise this temple, here in John chapter 9, we'll see a contrast between two types of people, just like we did in the earlier chapters of John, chapters 2 and 4, where the religious leaders were confused by what Jesus meant about raising up the temple in terms of Nicodemus, confused about what it meant to be born again. And then the contrast just 2 chapters later in chapter 4, where the official takes Jesus at his word and believes. And we'll have to scroll down to see that contrast here. And it happens in verses 37 to 41. Here, a man who was born blind is able to see, and not just that, but he's able to see Jesus for who he is, as the Son of Man. This is in contrast to the religious leaders, the Pharisees, who can actually see, but are blind and don't believe. So we can see here that again with Simeon, we have issues of identity, one being approved by God for a specific office, and the irony and contrast between the two types of people who are receptive to Jesus' message. The type of information that we've been looking at over the course of this study for the word sign in verse 41, it's stretched out over the course of John chapter 10. So I'm just going to overview it here without looking at each individual verse. The occasion is that Jesus is identified himself in verses 14 and 27 of John chapter 10 as the Good Shepherd, and in verse 36 as the Son of God. The characters involved here are the Jews in verse 24, and the event is that the works or signs point to his identity. And here's an important point. In verse 32, up here at the top, we can see that Jesus answered them, "I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you going to stone me?" So this is an example of how you can see there's overlap between different words. The word sign doesn't occur here, but the word work does, and it's used in a similar sort of fashion. So as you do these sorts of studies, you want to be mindful of how words have overlap in meaning and how are used in place of each other in certain contexts. Now, as a result of this conflict here in verses 32 and 33, they try to go about arresting Jesus. That's verse 39. And here John records the response of many. That they said, "John did no sign, but everything that John said about this man was true." And here again, sign is associated with believing. Jesus' raising of Lazarus from the dead is the occasion or background to this use of semeon in chapter 11, verse 47. The response to this sign that Jesus performs is that some believe, but others go to the Pharisees and tell them what Jesus had done. And the other characters involved in this passage are the chief priests and the Pharisees, as well as the council. And notice that Jesus' signs have created a dilemma for them. They say, "What are we to do? This man performs many signs." And the reason why it gets them into a dilemma is because on one hand they want to arrest, even kill Jesus to stop him. He's gaining all sorts of favor among the people. But at the same time, they know that signs are tied to one's validation before God. The result of all this, even though they've seen and heard the signs that Jesus has performed, is not one of belief. Instead, they plot to kill Jesus in verse 53. In John chapter 12, verse 18, a crowd goes out to meet Jesus because they heard that he had done this sign referring to Jesus' raising of Lazarus from the dead. Now all of this takes place at the occasion of the feast in Jerusalem, and the characters involved are Jesus' disciples as well as a crowd. And the response of the crowd here is similar to that of John chapter 6, where a crowd takes interest in Jesus because they had seen or heard that he had performed a sign. But notice that as before, there's no mention of faith or belief with regard to the crowd. But here we have the presence of the Pharisees, who are getting more and more frustrated by the fact that people are taking interest in Jesus. In verse 37, we have our second occurrence of semeon in John chapter 12. And here the background to this is that Jesus has entered into some conflict with the crowd over the understanding and expectation of the Christ. In verses 32 and 33, Jesus has referenced or predicted the way he was going to die. But clearly the crowd did not like this. Instead they answered him, "We have heard from the law that the Christ remains forever. How can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is the Son of Man?" So you can see that clearly the signs that Jesus has performed have made him a candidate for some offices here, the Christ or the Son of Man or the prophet. Now, the situation in John chapter 12 is similar to that of John chapter 6, where Jesus gives a teaching and the crowd either misunderstands it or takes it as a hard teaching. And as before, in verse 36, Jesus departs from the crowd and hides himself from him. If you remember earlier in John chapter 6, Jesus withdrew from the crowd because they tried to make him king by force. And again, the crowd had seen the many signs that he had done, but still did not believe in him. But here in verse 38, John gives some reasons as to why they didn't believe. And John supplies his own commentary here that Isaiah saw his glory and spoke of him. Now, even though people didn't believe, still many authorities did believe. But they didn't want to be put out of the synagogue. And then here in verse 43, another reference to glory, loving the glory of man, or the glory that comes from man, rather than the glory that comes from God. Now, I mention glory here because of the connection to John 1:14, where it says that we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only. And because in John chapter 2, John mentions that with the first sign, he manifested his glory. And so we can see a connection between sign and glory. Now I've come to the last occurrence of Semeion in the Gospel of John, and it occurs in John chapter 20, verse 30. And if you've noticed, we've skipped all the way from 1237 all the way to 2030. There's not an occurrence of Semeion in between there. So most of the occurrences are between chapters 1 and chapters 12. Because of that, scholars refer to the first 12 chapters of John as the Book of Signs. And here in John chapter 20, verse 30, we come to sort of a summary statement. John talks about how Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples. Those are the characters involved here in this occurrence. And the event is that these signs were witnessed by the disciples. Many more were done than were recorded, but John has picked these specifically for a purpose, and that purpose is expressed here by this conjunction, so that you may believe some specifics here, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, with the result that by believing you may have life in his name. So once again, signs are tied or associated together with believing, and this believing results in life. Okay, so now that we've made some observations for each occurrence of Semeion in the Gospel of John, it's time to synthesize what we've gathered or observed. We're still in the same note file here, but what I've done is I've gone up and added a note, titled it Sign in John, and then here, based off of the information that we've gathered from the different occurrences and context of Semeion in the Gospel of John, I've made my own definition of the word. Now, if you've watched the other videos about the different occurrences, you should be able to follow how I've put this together pretty easily. So, based on the occurrences above, a sign is a miraculous or mighty deed. We can see that with Jesus turning the water into wine, or healing the official's son in chapter 4, healing a man who was blind in chapter 9, and raising Lazarus from the dead in chapter 11. Now, these miraculous and mighty deeds aren't just sort of freak occurrences of nature. They're performed by a person. We can see that these references here, that Jesus did or performed these actions, and that these things were witnessed by others, as we can see from the references included here. And from the occurrences above, we see that the signs aren't just neat magic tricks or something like that. They tell us something about the person who performs them. It identifies one as having been commissioned by God and having legitimate authority from God. And we can see that in Nicodemus' question here in chapter 3, verse 2, where Nicodemus says, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the miraculous signs you were doing unless God were with him." And we also notice that the issue of signs intersects with authority. When Jesus drives out the money changers and merchants in the temple, the religious leaders come and ask him what right he has to do this. What sign will he show them to show that he has the authority to do those sorts of actions in the temple? Now, so far, we've made pretty good observations, but we can also take the occasion of these actions into account. And notice that oftentimes in the Gospel of John, the context of the Exodus event comes into play. Now remember, in these references, the Exodus itself, that word, doesn't appear in these verses. Instead, it's other words like the feast, like the Passover feast or the Feast of Tabernacles. Those certain feasts are tied to the Exodus event. And within that context, we can see that signs show that one has authority for two specific actions. The first is to speak on God's behalf. In these several verses here, Jesus talks about the testimony that he's giving, but people aren't listening to him. And also the sheep listening to his voice, here in John chapter 10, verses 8, 16, and 20. Now, tied to Jesus' action of speaking on God's behalf is his title, Son of God. Now, at the end of the Gospel, John mentioned that these signs function so that we might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Now, because of Jesus' unique relationship to the Father, he knows him and has unique access to him. This relationship gives Jesus the authority to speak on God's behalf. And also, because of his unique status, people not only hear from the Father, but they also, in a sense, see the Father, because the Son of God bears the image of God, showing what God looks like. The signs also show that Jesus has unique authority to deliver, so we can see here. And these are also the signs as well. In the Gospel of John, signs validate the identity of Jesus as the Christ, as we can see with the final reference of Simeon in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is called the Christ. That is, he's the legitimate ruler king over God's creation, is to protect and deliver their people from their enemies. You can see that kind of description or expectation even in Luke chapter 1, where it talks about Jesus as the Son of David, delivering the people of Israel from their enemies and from the hand of all who hate them. We see the same sort of action going on in John's Gospel, where Jesus is delivering people from death and from blindness. But these actions aren't an end in and of themselves. These actions listed above call others to faith in God, as we've seen time and time again in John's Gospel, that sign is tied together with faith or belief. And as it mentions here in John 20:31, that faith or belief in God isn't just a head knowledge, it actually results in life. And that life in John's Gospel is often referred to as eternal life. It's God's impartation of his life to us. Okay, so now that we've gathered this information and synthesized it in a sort of working definition based on our observations, we can now broaden the scope of our search and take into account other occurrences of Simeon in the New Testament and even outside the New Testament into the Old Testament. And then what we can do is open up our lexicons to compare and evaluate. So now that we've looked at the different occurrences of Simeon within John's Gospel, being one book, we're now ready to broaden our search range and look at the other examples or occurrences of Simeon within John's other writings. So we're going to go back to this search window here, and we're going to click on the drop-down that determines the range or search range. And if you haven't made this search range already, you can copy what I have below there, John, 1st through 3rd John, and Revelation. I've labeled this John and in parentheses all writings. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And now we get the search results within all of those books. And notice here are the ones that we've seen before from John's Gospel. And there aren't any from John's letters, but we do have a couple of occurrences in John's book of Revelation. Now, I'm not going to go through the same process that I did for John's Gospel, looking at each one of the occurrences and making a note about them. I just want to go through a couple of these occurrences and point out a few things. Now, the reason why we're broadening the search range is that we want to see if there are any similarities or differences between the occurrences that we saw in John's Gospel and the occurrences here in Revelation. So we want to look at what's the same, what's different, what gets added to our definition, or what's different to our definition. So here with the search results, we can just hover over the references. We can see that a great sign appeared in heaven. That's a little bit different than what we've seen in John's Gospel. Usually a person performs the sign, but here a sign appears in heaven. And it's the same here in verse 3. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. Now it gets really interesting when we get to chapter 13 below. And here we can see it performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. That there's some similarity between this occurrence here and the words surrounding it with the different occurrences that we saw in John's Gospel. So let's go ahead and click on this reference and open up our ESV. Now, going over to our Bible over here, I want to just scroll up a little, and we see the broader context. And looking at the context, you can see some of the similarities and differences between the use of signs here and in John's Gospel. So for example, remember we talked about authority linked together or associated with the word semeion? But notice, in contrast, that the one who performs the signs in this passage is not a human being, necessarily. It's a beast. And this beast performs an action that's extraordinary in nature. And it's done in front of people. Remember how we said before with sign in John's Gospel that it's witnessed by others? And notice below in verse 15, we have this language of image. Remember how Jesus, the Son of God, bearing the image of God? And here we have language of the image of the beast. And the beast might even speak. We mentioned that in John's Gospel that Jesus speaks on God's behalf. And notice that associated with the image and the sign and the authority is worship. This is somewhat like the instance in John 9 where Jesus heals a blind man, which the religious leaders and the blind man regarded as a sign. And by the end of that passage, Jesus tells the blind man that he is the Son of Man. And in response to that, the blind man worships Jesus. So you can see, even from just a quick survey, what things are different and what things are similar to the context here in Revelation and in the Gospel of John. Now, let's cast our net a little bit wider and look at the occurrences of semeion within the rest of the New Testament. So now we want to broaden our search results one more time and look at the occurrences of semeion throughout the New Testament. So I want to adjust our search range here to include the entire New Testament. And once again, we aren't going to look at each of the occurrences here. We just might scan over a few of them. You can see that the word semeion occurs in Matthew, as well as Luke's Gospel. We're back to John. And there are quite a few occurrences in Acts. So let's check out Acts 4:16. And coming over here to the ESV and scrolling up, we can catch a little bit of the context here. The background or occasion of this passage is that Peter and John were walking in the temple area at the gate called Beautiful, and they encounter a man who is lame from birth. And Peter, in response to his question for money, heals him in the name of Jesus. And because of this, they enter into conflict with the religious leaders. This passage has a lot in common with what we've seen in John so far, is that we have persons performing the sign or miracle. The sign is one of healing or restoration. And that sign here is witnessed by others and causes a lot of trouble for the religious leaders here. And keep in mind that the religious leaders aren't upset that a man was healed as much as what this sign means. What's troubling to the religious leaders is that this sign is performed in someone's name. And because of this, the sign says something about the name of Jesus. In a sense, it validates it as having power or being from God. And notice that in verse 17 and 18, they order them not to speak or teach in the name of Jesus. But in response, Peter and John refuse to listen to them. And then finally, in verse 21, we notice how people respond to this great healing. They're praising God for what happened. Now next, we'll look at the use of semeion in the Old Testament. Now we're going to look at the use of semeion within the Old Testament. And in order to look at the occurrences there, we're going to need to open up a Bible Word Study guide. So we want to go up to our guides and select Bible Word Study. And it automatically puts in semeion there for us. And we have a couple of sections here. I'm not going to worry about lemma or translation at this point. The part that I want to look at is down here, textual searches. And we want to look at LXX, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And we're in analysis view right now, but let's go ahead and switch over to verses view. And if you don't already have the ESV as an added translation here, you can go ahead and put that in. And we can see that semeion is used here in Genesis 1:14. where the lights are to be signs for seasons and for days and years. And you'll notice right away that that use of semeion is really quite different from what we've encountered in the New Testament and especially in John. So let's scroll down a little further. And you notice we actually have quite a few occurrences here, 115 total. Now we don't want to look through each one of these, so we want to take into consideration the context of the use of semeion in the Gospel of John. And if you remember, semeion often occurs around the time of the Passover, and the Passover is tied to the Exodus from Egypt event, which is recorded in the book of Exodus. And here in Exodus 7:3, we see that signs, or semeion, is paired together with wonders. These signs and wonders that God performs through Moses aren't just magic tricks. They're designed for a specific purpose. They're designed to show that God is sovereign over creation and sovereign over Israel, that God has rights to Israel, his son. And so these signs and wonders are a means to communicating that. In this way, they point to a greater reality. And finally, these signs and wonders also make it evident to Pharaoh that Moses is commissioned by God. Now, scrolling down to a section in Numbers, we can see another interesting occurrence of semeion. And the background to this verse is that the people, having been rescued or delivered from Egypt, are now in the wilderness, complaining and grumbling about God's provision in terms of food and leadership. And here the Lord says to Moses, "How long will this people despise me? And how long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I have done among them?" And you can see, if you think of the different occurrences of semeion in John's Gospel, we have some connections here. When Jesus was giving them or distributing the food among the people in John chapter 6, remember how the people started to grumble and complain? And then the crowd ended up, even though they had seen this great sign, ended up asking Jesus for another sign because they didn't believe. And now notice what he says about the people in verse 22 of Numbers chapter 14. That people, men, have seen his glory in the signs that he did in Egypt in the wilderness, but have put him to the test 10 times and have not obeyed his voice. And thinking back to John again, we have some similarities in terms of the context. That Jesus was showing his signs, and often that John mentioned his glory being manifested, particularly at the miracle of turning the water into wine, and the glory being revealed when he raised Lazarus from the dead. Even with all of those different signs, people still put Jesus to the test, questioning his authority and his relationship to the Father, and not obeying his voice. And if you think about that as well, remember how Jesus talked about being the good shepherd and the sheep hearing his voice? Also, in the other books like Isaiah, particularly Isaiah 63, the whole Exodus event and Moses' leadership of the people through the desert is talked about in shepherding terms. And that's what we have also going on in John chapter 10. Now, you can scroll through the rest of these results for yourself and look for other points of similarity or difference between the contexts, but I think you get the idea that making just a few observations in terms of context and what words are associated to different words can help you to see where a biblical author may be drawing from. You can see that John has made some connections here between what happened in the Exodus event with God's dealings with Israel in the wilderness and with Jesus' dealings with Israel there in John. Now, the same sort of process that I've shown you here, you can also do with other literature outside the Old Testament and New Testament. You'll just want to make sure that you really understand the context of the occurrences of that word in the literature. Okay, so now we're ready to take a look at our lexicons, and we can do that within the Bible Word Study Guide by going up to the section titled Lemma and clicking on the disclosure triangle. And here you'll see all the lexicons in my library, abbreviated in terms of their title, functioning as hyperlinks so that by clicking on any one of these titles here, or abbreviations, I can cut right to the article on semeion. Now, of course, we could start our Bible Word Study with our lexicons, going to them first. But I've taken you through this whole process so that you can see what kind of work you can do for yourself. You can see that you can gather information on a word just by looking at the passages, the context or the occurrences, and so that when you look at your lexicons, you can be more informed about what they're saying and how they're using those different references or occurrences. And finally, you'll get to seeing that actually what we did for ourselves is going to be much more specific than what you'll find in a lexicon. Now, that's not to say that whatever we do is going to always be better than a lexicon. It's just to say that we can have more focus because different lexicons have different purposes. Now, turning to the information supplied for us here, you'll notice that there's some blank spots for certain lexicons, while other lexicons provide a sort of glossary definition here. That's because some lexicons in our library have a section that's tagged glossary, and because of that, we're able to pull in this information. Some other lexicons don't have information like that tagged, and so you get these blank areas here. Now, in your section, you may see a different number of lexicons or a different order. I'm going to start with this first one because this is the one that's included in our reverse interlinear pane, and this is the Concise Strong's lexicon. And now let's go over and take a look at what type of information is included here. Here we can find the word in Greek, as well as pronunciation and transliteration. And we actually don't find that much information here. We get, in a sense, it's just a translation. It could be translated miracle, sign, token, wonder, but we don't get any extra information in terms of what this word means. So let's look at the second lexicon that's included in our reverse interlinear pane, and that's the Louw-Nida lexicon, also known as the Greek-English lexicon based on semantic domains. Now here, clicking on this one, we get to the index in the back, and if we click on this number here, the Louw-Nida number, we get to the article. And one of the things that's unique about the Louw-Nida lexicon is that they go beyond just providing translations of words. They actually try to get to a summary definition, or a definition that provides actual meaning of the word. So an event which is regarded as having some special meaning. And you'll notice that this definition is far more general than what we've put together for our word study in John. And that's okay, because this definition here is taking into account all the occurrences of semeon in the New Testament. You'll notice here are references to Matthew 24:3, which talks about the sign of Jesus coming and of the close of the age. Next, the article gives you some tips on translating this into other languages. And then we come across our first reference to John, here John 2:23. And it talks about the use of semeon in John's Gospel, that it's not simply a miraculous event, but something which points to a reality with even greater significance. And again, it gives a tip on translation. You could render it as a miracle with great meaning. And again, what we have here is a very general definition. Or I should say, it's a bit more general than what we have. It's not that it's wrong. This is actually a great point that they make here, that a sign, or semeon, points to a reality with even greater significance. And that's what we find in John's Gospel, that the miracles or mighty deeds that Jesus performs aren't just an end to themselves. They point to Jesus' identity as the Christ and as the Son of God, as one who's commissioned by God and having authority from God. That is what I would say is meant by the greater significance. And that revelation calls others to faith in God and to life in His name. Next, let's take a look at BDAG. And in this article on semeon, we'll notice that there are two definitions here provided for us that are bolded. A sign or distinguishing mark, whereby something is known, and then here's some translations, sign, token, indication, as well as a lot of references to other literature. And scrolling through this, you won't see the occurrence of anything from John until you get down to the next definition here. An event that is an indication or confirmation of intervention by transcendent powers, miracle or portent, And it's within this classification that we find a lot of references to the Gospel of John. And notice that this subsection talks about who performs the signs or miracles, that these are performed by God, by Christ, by men of God, as we've seen in John's Gospel. Jesus performed those signs, and then in Acts, they're performed by men of God, Peter and John. And scrolling down here, we can see the rest of our occurrences of Simeon and John's Gospel. And notice that what we're getting in this article are a lot of references and different citations to journal articles or commentaries. And scrolling down, there's also a lot of references to literature outside the Bible, which would be really helpful for looking at when you're trying to go to the Bible Word Study Guide. That section that I showed you, textual searches. You have things like pseudepigrapha and Philo and Josephus down there. And considering the amount of hits or results that you get in those sections, it might be a little overwhelming to go through each one. But here, with BDAG, you could get to some of the more relevant occurrences of the word. But now notice with our observations how specific we were able to get. This isn't to be any sort of knock on BDAG or something. It's just BDAG has a different purpose. Its focus is on classification, not necessarily exposition or something else like that. Now let's take a look at another few dictionaries here. The next one is the Exegetical Dictionary of the New Testament. This one's a little different because it doesn't classify its content like BDAG does. Instead, it structures it based on type of literature or corpus. Here we have the Gospels and Acts, the Epistles, Revelation. So we're interested in its use in the Gospel of John, so let's click on Gospels and Acts. And scrolling down, we'll get to see our section that pertains to the Gospel of John here at Part C. The exegetical dictionaries and theological dictionaries are going to have more commentary, something a bit more like what we have, and so they're going to be useful for comparison and evaluation here. This article mentions that these miracles manifest the glory and reveal the mission as the Son of God. It also notes that these signs provoke faith in Jesus and point beyond themselves to the eschatological Savior. These are things that we've also noted in our own definition. But it also notes that people show resistance to the sign, notes some connections between the things that Jesus had done and Moses, Elijah, and Elisha. And this dictionary makes an important observation here, that the signs that Jesus performed in John chapter 2, verse 11, and in 454 recalls the first two miracles of Moses and Elijah. And now let's take a look at the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, the abridged version here. The article here in TDNTA on Simeon is really long, and this is just the abridged version. If you want to see more of the references to Simeon, you can look at the unabridged version of TDNT. Now, in scrolling through this one, there are quite a few subcategories or subarticles included. As I mentioned before in the previous video, that TDNTA and TDNT are great for looking at the historical development of a word. In the coming videos, I'll mention a few cautions as to how you apply that information, but you should know that these dictionaries are a great resource for looking at the historical development of a word. And here we find Simeon in the Greek world. But let's take a look at some other relevant sections of Simeon. Here's the section on Simeon within the Johannine writings, which is another way of saying the writings of John. And here this article mentions that Simeon gives a certain confirmation. And there's some references supplied there. It notes that Simeon and Terata occur together, meaning signs and wonders. That was in John 4:48. And here they make a connection to Moses. And below it talks about Simeon with reference to John and the Revelation. And these are things that we had noticed too, about the beast performing great signs, leading people to idolatry. And jumping down in this article, there's another category or note here about John's special use of Simeon, the distinctiveness here. And it notes that the gospel writer's use of this word doesn't come from Hellenistic Gnosticism, but from the LXX, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament.
And notice the connection here. Here Semeon points to the self-declaration of the one God as Israel's God, and it bears a relation to faith on the one side and glory on the other. The works of Jesus are of the same kind as God's works at the Exodus. Remember the connection we made to Exodus in John chapter 6 and in Exodus and Numbers we looked at earlier? And here the mention of glory, the glory of the works as in the Old Testament, lies in the manifestation of the divine power. And if you remember that reference earlier about the glory, we have seen his glory in John 1:14, and also the glory revealed when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And this dictionary also mentions the connection to Moses here. The Semeon, or the Semea, thus have a similar function to the Semea of the Exodus. Yet as Jesus surpasses Moses, so his work surpasses that of Moses. And so the Semea acquire an enhanced significance. Jesus is a new Moses, but he is more, for he acts as God, and thereby shows himself to be the Son of God. So do you see how even with the theological dictionaries, we, just through our own gathering of information, in terms of the context and the occurrence of each word, have come to some of these same conclusions? Now that we've gathered information on the word, we can apply that information back to the word, being sensitive to the context. Remember, we don't want to take this information and just apply it everywhere to every single occurrence. We want to take it to the ones that are appropriate for the context. Now in the next series of videos, I'll show you how you can apply the information, what sorts of pitfalls to avoid. These are called fallacies.
Etymology refers to the study of the origin and historical development of a word. And at one time, this was thought to be the best method for finding out the meaning of a word. But in later years, scholars have concluded that it's not, in fact, the best method for determining the meaning of a word. So in this video, I want to show you what that fallacy looks like and why we should avoid it. So here we are in 1 Corinthians 1:2, and I want to find out more information about the meaning of the word church here in this verse. And so one option is to open up a Bible commentary. Now I have one here below, Paul's letters to a troubled church, 1 and 2 Corinthians. And in this commentary, there's a note here at verse 2, to the church. This is the Greek term ecclesia. Now I can go back up to my reverse interlinear pane and double check that, yes, that is indeed the Greek word here used for church. And going back to the commentary, commentator notes that it comes from two words, out of and called, and therefore the term implies the divinely called out ones. And we find this information informative, but we want to check out their sources, or check out what this commentator is saying up against a lexicon or two. So we have open up here Strong's Concise Dictionary of Greek and Hebrew Words. We can see that here this entry for ecclesia notes that it's a compound of two other words, and there are Strong's numbers here. So ek, meaning from or out of, and kaleo, which is translated to call. We can even check BDAG, and notice it provides the same sort of information here at the top. We have the word here, ecclesia in Greek, and also the words that it's derived from, ek and kaleo. So going back to the commentary, we can see that he's right. And while the information from all three of these resources has been informative, we don't want to just stop there in terms of what we read. So this commentator is right. The word ecclesia is indeed derived from two other Greek words, ek, which is translated out of, and kaleo, which is translated called. Though that's informative, we don't want to necessarily apply that information back to this particular verse in 1 Corinthians 1:2. Now the question comes up, why shouldn't we use the information if it's right and informative? And I'll answer that with just an example from everyday life. Let's say I asked you, do you know my friend Jim? And in response you said, yeah, I know Jim. He's a nice guy. And I asked myself, I wonder what he meant by nice. And so I open my Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary here to the article on nice, and I start reading. And right here it has some useful information about the history and origin of the word. Find it's from Middle English. We find that it says foolish, wanton, silly, simple, even ignorant. Now, do you see the problem here? I took the history, or I took the information about the historical development and origin of a word, and I applied it on to a particular context, and notice it didn't fit. So even though the information here is right, and it is informative, we don't want to necessarily apply it back to a particular context. And it's the same here with the word ecclesia in 1 Corinthians 1:2. And what's helpful about having the Greek lexicon by Leonida has some helpful information on this issue. Here there's a number, 1132, for ecclesia. And note their insight here. Though some persons have tried to see in the term ecclesia a more or less literal meaning of called out ones, this type of etymologizing is not warranted either by the meaning of ecclesia in the New Testament or even by its earlier usage. The term ecclesia was in common usage for several hundred years before the Christian era and was used to refer to an assembly of persons constituted by well-defined membership. So with each one of these resources here, this commentary that we looked at first, we want to make sure that we read all of what the commentator has to say, as well as in our lexicons, knowing what information to apply, why, and why not. Here in Ephesians 1:19, I have another example of a misappropriation of information to a word. This one's called semantic anachronism. And all that phrase means is it's a reading of a later meaning of a word back into an earlier occurrence of that word. Now, I'll flesh out exactly what that looks like in this video. It's easy to do that with Greek because many of our English words derive from Greek. So for example, say you're reading along in this verse, you come to this word power, and looking down at the reverse interlinear, you see this transliteration here of the lemma form. And in looking at it, you start to think, this looks like an English word I know, dynamite. Now you might think it's especially useful to make this connection from dunamis, power in Greek, and dynamite in English, because, well, power is an abstract noun, and dynamite would be something concrete, something we can envision, and we know what it does. And you might even find this sort of connection in a Bible commentary. For example, look at the Bible exposition commentary. This commentator notes that so tremendous is this truth that Paul enlisted many different words from the Greek vocabulary to get his point across. Dunamis, and here this transliteration, power, as in dynamo and dynamite. And another commentator also makes the same connection here from the College Press NIV commentary series. Here it says, power, dunamis, here the Greek and the transliteration, means great force and might, often even used to describe the power of Jesus' miracles. This same word was well suited to name the explosive invention, dynamite. So both commentators here note a connection between the Greek word dunamis and the English word dynamite. And it's true that there is some connection there in terms of form, but not necessarily meaning. And you want to be careful not to apply that kind of information back into a particular context. And here's why. Let's go back up to verse 19 here of Ephesians chapter 1. Now, looking at power in this context, even in the English, we can see there's not a suggestion of anything explosive happening in these couple of verses. In fact, the power referenced here in this verse is tied to the resurrection power manifested when Jesus was raised from the dead. This power is not actually like dynamite, which destroys things and blows things up. Instead, the power is like that of a new life, made alive. And in this context, this broader context, if you go on and read Ephesians 2, you'll see that while we were dead in transgressions, God raised us up to life and made us alive. And that resurrection power to a new life now enables us to carry out the good works which He planned for us to do. So also, it would just be difficult to understand Paul was referencing dynamite in this context to people who would not have known what dynamite even was. That's why you want to be careful what kind of information you apply back to a particular word. While it may be true that the English word dynamite derived from dunamis, that would be a semantic anachronism, reading the later meaning of a word back into an earlier occurrence of a word. While making those types of connections can be interesting, you'll find plenty of information on a word just by looking at its context. With an example from John 10:11 and this use of the word good, I want to show you another fallacy called illegitimate totality transfer. And that means an assumption that any or all of the potential meanings that a word can have can be applied to a word wherever it occurs. That was a mouthful. Let me show you what I mean. Say we want to do a study here on the word good. Now, we've made the switch from English into Greek here with the word kalos. And we want to open up a lexicon on this word. Now, I already have open here Strong's Concise Dictionary, and it gives me some different translation or glossary definitions of the word. Here it notes that it can be translated beautiful, good, that is valuable or virtuous, as well as better, fair, good, as well as these other words. Now, in the illegitimate totality transfer fallacy, I would make the assumption that any one of these translations here could fit the context of John 10, verse 11. Or to put it simply, I think that any of these translations would work in that passage or verse. Now, using a lexicon like this one, it's easier to make that assumption because we don't have verse references here in the dictionary entry for the word. So it lends itself to this fallacy a bit more than, say, another lexicon like BDAG, for example. If we take a look at that lexicon, and you'll see it does two things. It provides a definition of the word instead of just a translation, and it provides references and classifies those references under the different uses of the word. So, for example, the article begins with a definition here of kalos, to meeting high standards or expectations of appearance, kind, or quality. And it references here a couple different writings by Homer, for example, and Josephus. And it does the same in the New Testament. Here we have another definition, to being attractive in outward appearance, and there are a couple translations here, beautiful, handsome, fine, and there's a reference here from the New Testament. Now notice that our reference, John 10, verse 11, doesn't occur here under this definition. If we scroll down to the next one, number 2, to being in accordance at a high level with the purpose of something or someone, translated good or useful, we notice that there are subcategories. And as you can see by the references below, the majority of the uses of this word in the New Testament have to do with this definition here. And if we scroll down, we still don't see our reference in John chapter 10 of moral quality. And here we are. So under the definition, being in accordance at a high level with the purpose of something or someone, in any respect, and here are some translations, unobjectionable, blameless, excellent. Here's our verse. So notice that the lexicon didn't list this reference in each one of the definitions and every subcategory. The list of references here in the article, along with the definitions and classification, shows that a word can't mean all of its potential meanings all at the same time wherever it occurs. What I call the one meaning fallacy assumes something like this, that a word only has one basic meaning, and that's the meaning of the word wherever it occurs. Now say we're reading through John's Gospel and his letters. One of the words that comes up quite often is the word cosmos, which is translated world. And say we wanted to understand a bit more of what this word means, so we look it up in the Strong's lexicon and we read something like this. From the base of this other Strong's number here, and we read orderly arrangement, that is, decoration. Now, we would run into a problem if we took that meaning or translation and applied it to every place where that word occurs. Here in the ESV, we're in John 3:16, a very well-known verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. We can see that the word translated world comes from the Greek word cosmos, and looking at the Strong's number below, we see it's G2889, the same number we saw in the lexicon above. Now we also have open here 1 John 2:15, which reads, Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, not in him. And we can see that this word translated world comes from the same Greek word we saw in John 3:16, cosmos. And we can also see that the same Strong's number is used here, 2889. But we have a problem. John seems to contradict himself. Over here in John 3:16, God loves the world. But then over here in 1 John 2:15, there's a command that we aren't supposed to love the world. And even more than that, it says, if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So does this mean that because God loves the world, the Father's love isn't in him? It can get really confusing. And it doesn't help when we look at the Strong's numbers and see that they are the same number. Nor would it help us to take that meaning that we saw in the Strong's lexicon, orderly arrangement, and plug it in here. For God so loved the orderly arrangement. And we going over here to 1 John 2:15, do not love the orderly arrangement, or the things in the orderly arrangement. That doesn't help us figure out what's going on here either. What you need to be reminded of here is that words have multiple meanings. The technical term for having multiple meanings is polysemy. When you run into an issue like this, it's important to know which resources to go to. If you were to run a Bible word study, say on cosmos, you would come up with a translation ring that would look something like this. And that doesn't really help us here because this is just telling us how the word cosmos is translated in the ESV. It's not necessarily showing us the range of meaning of the word. I bring this up because you need to know that the range of translation of a word isn't the same as the range of meaning of a word. Now, this ring shows us that the majority of the time in the ESV, the Greek word cosmos is translated world. But as we saw below here in our two open ESV Bibles, we see that though it's translated here world, we've run into a problem. Now, the resource you can go to is the Greek English lexicon based on semantic domains by Launida. Down here you can see it in the line of the reverse interlinear. And you'll notice that the two numbers are different between these occurrences of cosmos. Here we see that the Launida number is 9.23. And if we read it, we see a figurative sense of meaning of cosmos, meaning cosmos or universe. People associated with a world system and estranged from God. In other words, translated people of the world. So if we were to take that meaning and read it here, for God so loved the people of the world, that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Now let's take a look at 1 John 2:15. And here we notice that the Launida number is not 9.23, but 41.38. And when we hover over that, we get a system of practices and standards associated with secular society, that is, without reference to any demands or requirements of God. And this could be translated world system, world standards. And if we take that translation and plug it in here, do not love the world systems or the things in the world systems. Do you see the difference between the two meanings of this word, even though it is the same word? So you need to be aware that words have a range of meaning. You don't want to just take a basic meaning and apply that everywhere the word occurs. And just one last tip, if you want to see the range of meaning of a word, you can use the Launida lexicon to do so. Just click on the link, open it up here, and under this menu, make sure that you have checked Send Hyperlinks Here. When you have that checked, you'll see a target appear up here, and then you can double-click on this word, the head word lemmiform. And when you do so, you get to another section of the Lounaida lexicon that lists the range of meaning that a word has. Remember to keep in mind that this is not saying this is how the word is translated. For that type of information, you would want to look at the translation ring in the Bible Word Study Guide. Something else that you want to be careful not to do when doing a word study is separating the word and its translation from its culture. So for example, here we are in 1 Timothy chapter 6, and we're looking at the word slaves here, and we want to find out more about the word, and we can go down to the Strong's number here and read what it has to say. It can be translated slave, frequently therefore in a qualified sense of subjection or subserviency, a servant, bondman. We can even read what Lounaida has to say about it. Pertaining to a state of being completely controlled by someone or something, with the translation subservient to or controlled by. Now, we can read these definitions, and they're not wrong, they're right. However, we can still walk away, but our actual understanding as to the concept of slavery hasn't really changed. So instead of just looking at a lexicon and the translation of the word, instead we need to understand something of the culture. So for example, I've opened up a search here, and I've ran the search not on just slave, but on slavery. And you'll see that underneath topic, I get a list of dictionaries here. And one of them is Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary. Now I've already opened this dictionary up to a certain spot in the article, and that has to do with this section here on slavery and the New Testament. And in the section of the article it notes that slavery in the first century was different than slavery that was practiced in the New World. The slavery of the New World is the kind of slavery that we in the West are most familiar with. And it points out several of the distinctives between slavery in the first century and slavery in the New World. And here we learn that racial factors played no role in first century slavery, that education was greatly encouraged and enhanced the slave's value. Slaves could carry out sensitive or responsible social functions. Slaves could own property. They could have religious and cultural traditions, like those who were freeborn. They could assemble in public. And they could anticipate being freed or emancipated by the time they were 30. Remember, words occur in space and time, and so you never want to separate the culture from the word, focusing just on its translation. This next fallacy I'm about to show you, I would call application without context. It's when you look up a word in a lexicon and take one of the translations there provided in the entry and apply it back to the word without regard for the original context. Here's what it looks like. Have you ever heard of someone say that the Greek word parthenos, which is translated into English virgin, can also be translated maiden or young maiden? Now the implication of that for a verse like this one, Luke 1:27, is that it could read, and the young maiden's name, or the maiden's name, was Mary. And so, in effect, it would deny the virgin birth of Christ. And so, when you hear this, you go to your reverse interlinear, and you click on the Strong's number here to get to your lexicon. And going up, you look at the information provided here, and you see that, in fact, parthenos can be translated maiden, which, in its most general sense, would be considered a young unmarried woman. Now, we may also note that the rest of the article here mentions that it's an unmarried daughter and that has the implications of being a virgin. Now, if you are unaware of the general principles or rules of language, you might think that it would be okay to take either one of these translations, either maiden or daughter, and apply it back to the verse. But the problem with this is that it ignores the context of the passage. Let's look back at Luke 1:27, and here in verse 27, we see that it's translated, and the virgin's name was Mary. Now, this translation is more than just a bias from a Christian. Let's go and look at verse 34, just a few verses down. And here, Mary's response to the angel is, "How will this be, since I am a virgin?" And now we want to select this word, and you'll notice that the word here for virgin in the Greek is not parthenos. Instead, it would read very literally, I know not a man, which is Mary's way of saying, I have not had sex with a man. So now you can see why we don't take just any translation out of a lexical entry and apply it back to a word without regard for the context. And you can see that the translators appropriately translated the word Parthenos, virgin, because later on in verse 34, Mary herself says that she's a virgin.
So to summarize, here are the steps I've taken you through. First, identify a key word in a passage. Next, gather information on that word using your concordance and lexicons. And finally, apply that information back to the word with sensitivity to the grammar and the context.